Hello, my name is Krista Russell, and this is for my Capstone class. My research question is, what are effective strategies at the government and human level that are currently being implemented to help victims of human trafficking? This speech examines effective strategies from the literature at both the government and human level to help victims of human trafficking. The government level specifically looks at the debate at focusing on the supply of human trafficking or the demand. Supply and demand debate, where supply is providing forced labor or sex slaves for consumers, and the demand are the consumers themselves who are the market for these illicit activities. Regarding the human level, the speech looks at the challenging issue of whether or not to ask rescue victims to cooperate with law enforcement to prosecute their traffickers. Asking them to cooperate subjects them to further trauma, fear, and compromises both their safety and the safety of their families. However, not asking them to cooperate and focusing solely on the rehabilitation and reintegration process severely limits law enforcement's ability to build a case against traffickers. We will look at the pros and cons of this in the literature and evaluate what is the best way to help victims of human trafficking. On the government level, like drugs and arms trafficking, human trafficking is a market-driven criminal industry that is based on the principles of supply and demand. Many factors make children and adults vulnerable to human trafficking. Yen believes that for too long, governments and law enforcement have focused solely on the supply side of human trafficking and not enough on the demand side. Yen states that within the international community, there is now an emerging consensus that strategies which solely address the supply side of sex trafficking are inefficient and ultimately ineffective. Yen also argues that by focusing on demand, it would eliminate both the supply and demand. Human trafficking is the need for cheap labor, whether through domestic servitude or the commercial sex industry. To effectively meet this demand, Yen argues that this can be done through educational, legislative measures aimed at reducing the male demand for commercial sexual services. These methods include educating the men who use prostitutes, changing misguided male attitudes towards commercial sexual services and prostitutes, and enacting and enforcing legislation that criminalizes the purchase of sex. This has already been done in one big monumental shift for the international community because finally a country has made the purchase of sex illegal. This has been done in Sweden. Many countries are looking into the Swedish model due to its success. Although not perfect, this law has made drastic improvements in the last 15 years since the law was enacted in 1999. Fewer prostitutes. Troll states we have significantly less prostitution than our neighboring countries, even if we take into account the fact that some of it happens underground. Sweden now only has between 105 and 130 women, both on the internet and on the street, active in prostitution in Stockholm today. In Oslo, it's 5,000. Another benefit of the ban is that hardly any country in the European Union has fewer problems with human trafficking. According to the Swedish police, 400 to 600 foreign women are brought to Sweden each year to be prostitutes. In Finland, which is only half the size of Sweden, that number is between 10,000 and 15,000. Han Deep from Loyola University in his journal article debates that focusing on the supply side is the best option for combating forced prostitution. Deep states that the commercial sex industry is like fast food. It's quick and cheap, and it's a cheap meal. Fast food and the sex industry are both driven by consumer consumption, subject to the economic principles of supply and demand. Siddhartha Kara states that the more the slaves are, the cheaper the product becomes. If there were only 5 slaves, then the price for a sexual act is much more expensive, making it out of reach for many people like day laborers in India. However, there are hundreds of prostitutes, which make the prices of sexual acts affordable to nearly everyone. I think we should focus on the supply and demand side, focusing on supply by educating women and men about human trafficking, supporting schools that are proactively going into communities and seeking out the most vulnerable and helping these people. On the flip side, then continue to educate the men who use prostitutes, as Yen states, and continue to help change misguided male attitudes towards commercial sexual services and prostitutes, and enacting and enforcing legislation that criminalizes the purchase of sex. Helena Cruz, a nurse who has been working for more than 15 years in the admission clinic for drug-addicted women in Malmo and knows almost every hooker in the city, states that by making it illegal to purchase sex, it has forced prostitution to go underground and has increased violent acts towards women and increased sexually transmitted diseases. This Cruz states, although this has happened, she agrees with the Swedish model because there is no such thing as a happy whore. Most of these women, whether they choose this life or not, all use drugs and sedate themselves because they come from a hard past of being raped by someone they knew. The human level. There is a story by an unknown author where a little boy is on a beach of starfish that got washed up on the shore. This little boy starts to throw them back one by one. To this little boy, he knew he could not save them all, but to a single starfish it mattered. So in the topic of the human level, does law enforcement and non-governmental agencies focus solely on rehabilitation and integration, or surveillance and prosecution? This question stems from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA. In the United States, the T visas are given to victims who are found to be actually trafficked. Under the Department of Homeland Security, it is authorized to issue up to 5,000 T visas per year. However, from the year that the TVPA was enacted in 2000 through November 1st, 2008, only 1,318 number of T visas were granted by the Department of Homeland Security to human trafficking survivors. Why is this happening? The question is, are there less victims being properly cared for and less cases being taken to trial for the simple fact that in order for a victim to receive care, they need to cooperate with law enforcement? Several case managers felt that the certification requirement that victims cooperate with law enforcement and prosecution can be emotionally traumatic because they often have to relive their experiences during case preparation. For example, during stress interviews in which they are interrogated as if they were hostile witnesses and testifying. Aaron Zweig and Newmark state they may also be in great fear for their safety or their family's safety, since traffickers are often compatriots who have a great deal of power, money, and influence in their home country or village or in the city's ethnic community in this country. In the Aaron Zweig and Newmark journal article, they conducted several interviews with human trafficking victims who had already reintegrated back into society. In these interviews, they asked the victims several questions, but in this regard, these questions were in reference to family and home countries and why they would not testify. I have really big concerns about that, and before I agreed to speak with the government, that is the most thing I worry about, because my trafficker knows my family, so I get worried about it if I speak to the government that he is going to retaliate against my family. This was another interview question, and they responded, the traffickers who are now back in my home country pressure my sister to tell them where I am. I'd be afraid to go back there because of them. Wickman details the importance to the reintegration process and how all the effort and time that freedom fighters place in rescuing people from slavery all hinges on the reintegration process. Reintegration is often one of the greatest challenges for individuals because of the stigma attached to the sex trade, regardless of how they were involved. The rehabilitation process should continue far into the future and potentially may never end. Wickman details specific strategy for reintegration. Many NGOs report that successful strategies include family visits during rehabilitation, gradual reintroduction into the community, job training, and seed money to establish a self-sufficient livelihood. All of these areas are integral for victims to have any success at leading a normal life where they can be contributing members of society. In conclusion, this is a big issue that needs to be addressed both skillfully and comprehensively by many people working together. With that said, it's vitally important that these efforts are not duplicating each other or misdirected on the wrong issues. Based on my analysis of the literature, I think victims are best helped at the government level by focusing supply and demand together to holistically address the issue. while at the human level it would be further injustice to ask these victims without sensitivity and understanding to cooperate with law enforcement to prosecute their traffickers. There is no answer to this debate because it always depends on the situation. I think we have to be opportunistic where we can, knowing when to meet the supply or demand. When faced with a traumatized, scared person coming out of slavery, knowing when to ask for cooperation should be case by case, knowing that asking them could subject them to more traumas or that subjecting their family or themselves to danger and harm, but also knowing so would help build a case against traffickers, potentially setting more people free or preventing more people from being trafficked. So does law enforcement stay reactive or proactive? The only way to do this is to ask victims to cooperate and to act as a witness. I think being holistic and opportunistic is the key. When a victim has the courage to stand against their trafficker, law enforcement needs to be opportunistic and have mechanisms in place to protect these victims as much as possible. On the other hand, nobody can ask one of these victims to undergo more traumas, more fear, or more danger after what they have been through. Thank you again, and this was Crystal Russell.